Welcome back. Today we're going to continue talking about real numbers. We're going to talk about real numbers by talking about taking our conversions and putting them in order from least to greatest using a number line. Let's go ahead and get started right now. So here we are talking about comparing in number lines. We're going to start off by taking a look at example A. So here we are at example A, and it wants us to graph these values on the number line, 1/4 and 4/5. We have a little bit of a problem with our number line. Our number line goes from 0 to 1, and we have a whole bunch of spaces there. We don't really know the different measurements of this number line, so we're not really sure where we could put 1/4 or 4/5. So we're going to have to figure out what these measurements are before we can put these numbers on the number line. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm trying to figure out how the spacing on a number line works is I need to remember, count the spaces, not the lines. Counting the spaces between the lines will tell me what this number line is broken up into. So if I count, I've got 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4 spaces. So since I have 4 spaces, I know that this number line is broken into fourths. If I had counted lines, I would have thought it was broken into thirds, and that just won't work. So since there are 4 spaces, I know this number line is broken into fourths, so I'm going to put my fractions here. I know this is 1/4. I know the second part is 2/4, or I can reduce that fraction to 1/2, because anytime I'm working with fractions, I want to make sure that I put them in simplest form, and then my last fraction is going to be 3/4. All right, now this is all well and good. I have to graph these values on the number line, and for 1/4, it's pretty easy. 1/4 is right where 1/4 is going to be, so I can put a little dot there over 1/4, and I can write 1/4. Now, it's a lot harder to graph 4/5 because 4/5 doesn't really work with these fractions. They don't have the same denominator, so I'm going to have to figure out a way to determine where 4/5 is working on this number line. And the easiest way to do that is to turn all of my fractions into decimals, because as we talked about earlier, the easiest way to work with different types of numbers is to turn them all into decimals. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to start by turning the decimals into the number line first. Now I could divide the top by the bottom as we talked about, but some of these I may have memorized. So I know that 1/4 is 0.25, so that goes for that number there, 1/4, and also this number 1/4. I know that 1/2 is 0.50. And I know that 3/4 is 0.75. Now I may not have 4/5 memorized, so I'm going to divide 4 divided by 5 in my calculator, and that's going to give me 0.08. But as you can see, 0.08 is not any of the lines of my number line, but I'm still going to have to graph it. So since my 8 is a little bit bigger than this 7, I know that it's going to be to the right of that. It's not going to be all the way at 1, but it's going to be a little bit past 0.75, so I'm going to go ahead and put a dot, and I'm going to label that 4/5. And there I've labeled both points on my number line by turning everything into decimals. It made it much easier to work with, and I'm going to have to remember that moving forward. Now let's take a look at example B. Here we are at example B, and again in example B we're going to be filling in the missing increments on the number line and graphing these values on the number line. So again, I'm going to start by counting the spaces, not the line on my number line. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I know there are 10 spaces, which means my number line's broken into tenths. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in my fractions and fill in my decimals. I'm going to do that very quickly using a little bit of magic. There we go. I've got all of my fractions and all of my decimals all said and done. Now, it may take you a little bit of time to fill these in, but you can go ahead and do that now as we're graphing these values on the number line. So I've got 4/5 and 1/4. Again, I don't really know what those are. Those are fractions, and I've got some fractions, some decimals, but I don't know. I don't see 1/4 on here. I do see 4/5, so that one will be easy. But I'm going to go ahead and move everything into a decimal. So 4 divided by 5 is going to give me 0.8. And 1 divided by 4 is going to give me 0.25. So I've got everything as a decimal now. So I'm going to go ahead and graph those on my number line. So I've got 0.80. I know that's going to go right here on this line. So I've got 4/5 right over the 4/5. And then I've got 0.25. Now 0.25 isn't one of the lines on this number line, but I see that it falls between the 2 and the 3.0. I've got 0.20, 0.30, I've got 0.25. That's right in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot right between the two lines, and I'm going to label that 1/4. and I've labeled my points on my number line. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next practice problem. Here we are at example C, and example C is asking us something different than we've been dealing with so far. It's saying which values are greater than y. So we have to figure out what the value of y is, we have to figure out the missing pieces of the number line, and then we're given several numbers down below, and we have to figure out which one of those several numbers is greater than y. So we have several steps to complete in this problem. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out the missing pieces on our number line. If we figure out the missing pieces on the number line, the y is on one of those lines, so we'll know what the value of y is. So let's go ahead and do that first. So I'm going to start with my counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I counted my spaces, so I know this is an eighth. So I'm going to write out my fractions. I'm going to write out my decimals. I'm going to be doing that with a little bit of magic. So I've done that now. I've got my fractions, I've got my decimals, so that was good to know. Now I know that y is at 3/8, and I know the decimal for that is 0.375. So I'm going to look to see below if the numbers that are there, I've got square roots, I've got decimals, I've got scientific notation, I've got percentages, I've got fractions. I'm going to determine if any of those, or some of those, or all of them are greater than 3/8 or 0.375. So I'm going to have to start by turning them all into decimals, because the decimal is the king of all of the number types. It allows us to compare things very easily. So I'm going to start by turning 1/4 into a decimal. So I've got 1 divided by 4. That's going to give me 0.25. Is 0.25 bigger than 0.375? I don't believe so, because the 2 is smaller than the 3, so that is not a correct answer. I can move on to the next one. So there I've got 9.3 times 10 to the negative second. Now the key there is the negative in the exponent, so I know I'm going to be moving my decimal to the left. I'm going to be moving my decimal to the left 2 spaces, and when I do that I get 0.093. Now I have to determine, is this greater than y? I'm going to take a look, and it looks like this 0 is going to be smaller than that 3, so that is not larger than y, so it is also not a correct answer. Then I've got the square root of 7. Luckily for me, I've picked up my calculator. I'm going to push 7 in the calculator. I'm going to hit my square root button. When I do that, I end up with 2.64 ... going on forever and ever, because it's not a number that's going to end. And is 2.64 greater than 0.375? You bet. 2 is going to be way bigger than this decimal. So that is going to be one of my correct answers. I can go ahead and throw a circle around that. Now I've got 0.38. Oh, good news. 0.38 is already a decimal, so I don't have to do any kind of conversion. And I can see the 3 and the 3 are going to be equal, so that's not going to work out. So I'm going to have to go to the next number. And the next number in the line is, I've got an 8, and my 8 is going to be bigger than my 7, so I know this is a correct answer. So I go ahead and circle that, because I know that one is right. The last thing I have is a decimal there, or is a percent, so I'm going to have to move my percent to a decimal, and if I remember how to do that correctly, I can either divide by 100, or I can move my decimal 2 places to the left as my shortcut. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 0.362. So again, I have to check. The 3 and the 3 are the same, so that's not going to be helpful. My second number here is a 6, and this second number up there is a 7. The 7 is going to be greater than the 6, so this number is not greater either, so that gets an X. So the only 2 correct answers I have are the square root of 7 and 0.38. Those are the values that are greater than y on my number line. Make sure that your paper looks like mine. Take the time to put in the work that I've put in, so that when you go back and take a look at these, you understand what we were talking about. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So here we are at example D. And example D says which numbers have the value greater than A and less than B. So we're going to try and find the numbers that fall between A and B. So the first thing I've got to do is figure out my number line. Then I've got to figure out what the numbers are below, make some decimals, and let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start by counting on my number line. Now, I'm not going to count between A and B, because those aren't the beginning and end of my number line, and it won't be super valuable, just count between A and B. So I'm going to count between 2 and 3 on my number line. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I've got 10 spaces so that I know my number line is broken into tenths. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in my fractions, fill in my decimals. I'm going to do that with a little bit of magic. So there we go. I've got my fractions, I've got my decimals, they're all right there. So now I have to take a look at my numbers below, where I've got a percent, an improper fraction, a square root, and a scientific notation, and we're going to see which ones fall between A and B. So in this case, I've got A as a decimal is 2.2, and b is a decimal as 2.6, because again, we're going to translate everything into decimals, just easier to work with them that way. So I'm going to start with my 23.45%. Well, that's a percent right there. I'm going to either divide by 100 or move my decimal 2 places to the left. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 0.2345. And I'm going to try to determine if that is between 2.2 and 2.6. It doesn't appear that it does. The 0 in front alone eliminates it because that is nowhere near between the 2's. So I can go ahead and mark that one as not a correct answer. The next thing I've got is an improper fraction. So to turn my fraction to a decimal, I'm going to divide the top by the bottom. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 2.3 repeating. And I'm going to determine if 2.3 repeating is between 2.3 and 2.6. So 2.3 repeating would continue these 3's on and on and on. So that 3 is going to probably be greater than this 0 here. So I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, yes, that does fall between 2.3 and 2.6. So that is a correct answer. I'm going to go ahead and circle that. The next one I've got is 2.5 times 10 to the negative second. I see my negative exponent, so that means I'm going to be moving my decimal 2 places to the left. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 0.025, and that 0 again is going to eliminate it. It does not fall between 2.2 and 2.6 if it's not even 2, so I can go ahead and put an X through that. That is not the correct answer. And the last one is the square root of 6. I'm going to go ahead and put the 6 in my calculator, hit that square root button. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 2.499949 on and on and on forever and ever and never stopping. So when I get that, I determine is that between 2.2 and 2.6, and it is. The 4 falls between the 2 and the 6, so that is a correct answer. So I can go ahead and circle that, and I determine that I've got 7/3 and the square root of 6 is the only correct answers there. Go ahead and make sure that your paper looks like mine, and when it's done, we'll move on to the next one. So here we are at example E. In example E, we're going to type in each statement with either a greater than or a less than or an equal to. We're trying to determine which symbol goes in between. So again, I've got fractions, I've got percents, I've got a scientific notation, I've got a square root. So I've got to turn everything into decimals because it's the only way I can compare things. So I'm going to start with 1/3, and that has to be one of the ones that I have memorized, and I have that memorized as 0.33 repeating. And I've got 30%. I'm going to either divide by 100 or move my decimal 2 places to the left. When I do that, I end up with 0.30. So now I need to compare them. They both start with 3. Okay, that's not going to be a determinant factor. But my second number here is 0, and my second number over here is a 3. So the 3 is going to be greater than the 0. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my greater symbol here. There we go. Draw that in. My greater symbol as 1/3 is greater than 30%. Let's take a look at my next problem. So my next problem, I've got 0.3%. Now this might be very confusing. I've got a decimal and a percent. It is not a decimal. It is a percent. It is a decimal percent. However, it is not just a decimal. So I got to go ahead and make sure that I'm going to take my 0.3% and I'm going to move that percentage to a decimal by either dividing by 100 or moving my decimal 2 places to the left. And when I do that, I should end up with 0.003 because I've moved my decimal 2 places to the left. So I've got a very, very small decimal there. Now I've got my 2.7 times 10 to the negative first. So I've got a negative exponent, so I know I'm going to be moving to the left. I've got 1, so I know I'm going to be moving my decimal place 1 point. And when I do that, I'd end up with 0.27. So now I need to compare and see which one is larger. I've got a 2 here. I've got a 0 here. So my 2 is going to be larger than my 0. So I know that this one is going to be less than, or the 0.3% is less than 2.7 times 10 to the negative first. Let's take a look at my last problem here. I've got the square root of 5, so I'm going to take my 5, put it in my calculator. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 2.236 ... on and on and on forever and ever. And then I've got 230%. So again, I'm going to divide that by 100, or I'm going to move my decimal 2 places to the left. When I go ahead and do that, I end up with 2.30. So now I'm going to compare them. I've got a 2 and a 2, so that's not useful. I've got a 2 and a 3. The 3 is bigger than my 2, so I'm going to go ahead and say that the square root of 5 is less than 230%. And I've gone ahead and completed all of my problems here. And you can see that brings us to the end of this set of notes. So if you like this video, go ahead and throw us a thumbs up. If you love this video, go ahead and throw us a sub, and we will catch you in the next one.